Hey guys, it's Loman02. I'm going to be doing a recording of some 93-94 old school content, which is cards only from the initial ABU run, Antiquities, Legends, The Dark, Fallen Empires, and what am I missing? Arabian Nights, Legends, I think I said all of them. Anyways, this is the deck we're going to be playing today. We're playing the deck. We're going to be playing against fellow YouTuber Jordan, as part of a duo of Cardboard Confrontation, Eli and Jordan on that channel. And we're going to be playing a mirror match of sorts. So he has a version of the deck. I have my version here. This is a pretty neutral bias version, as it only has 2 James Tomes, 2 Disrupting Scepters. This is set up for EC rules, so it has additional lands. It has 2 additional lands, and I would typically play under European rule construction, putting it at 19. This deck has 30 mana sources in it. It's a very mana-laden deck. Basically just outdraws the opponent, counters the important spells, disenchants the important stuff, Swords to Plowshares the important stuff, and then eventually wins through a Fireball or just attacking with Mistress Factories. That is the deck. Quick pause, guys. We'll jump into the gameplay, and hopefully you guys enjoy. Alright guys, back, and we have a very powerful opener this game, so this is a little bit risky, but what it does do is if my opponent doesn't have a disenchant or a way to interact early, it's going to allow us to get ahead on cards with the James Tome. Unfortunately, unless we get an untap step, we do not produce double blue with this deck, with this hand, and really only have access to 1 follow-on spell in the form of disenchant, pending whatever we draw. So we are relying on hitting blue sources pretty heavily. Alright, opponent plays on a Mox but does nothing else important. We drew a Time Walk, which is castable now, but I think I'd rather cast out to the James Tome and try to start getting ahead. Opponent does not have Disenchant, which allows us to draw our first card, which means that James Tome has now netted us, well, has now replaced itself. Time Twister happens. My opponent's probably looking for a way to disenchant my James Tome. I find a library, which is very fortunate. I actually allow Ancestral to resolve. I do think that in this matchup, depending on what your current position is, sometimes it's actually more correct to allow card draw to resolve, because from my opponent's position, Jordan's position, he actually has to deal with a bunch of stuff on board, which means he has to be the first to act. I don't really have to be the first to act here. As you can see, he is the first to act. He disenchants again. I go ahead and counterspell him. A better way that he probably could have sequenced this is disenchanted on his main and then gone to the end step, because I did play the Lotus out. However, I can see why he didn't, because I was using library, so it wasn't clearly apparent why I played the Lotus out. It may have just been may have seemed like I was just playing it out, so I'd have to discard it. But I actually actively wanted that card on the board. I could have countered this, but I don't counter this. I'm far enough ahead on cards now, and I have an active library that I figure it's better just to let the disenchant resolve there. I go ahead and DT on the stack, Loa. Find a Disrupting Scepter. I think Disrupting Scepter is actually more important than James Tome is to actually win this matchup. I think you really want Scepter first, and then you want Tome. You really want to limit their options, your opponent's options in this matchup. End up drawing a card, but we kind of had a very heavy lead in the beginning, and we're kind of just cementing it now is kind of what we're looking to do. We're basically just trying to lock them out of the game, which eventually it feels like we're going to be able to do. They do get rid of our Loa there, so our source of drawing an extra card a turn is now gone. Jordan kind of another worthless card. Go ahead and get rid of one of the cards in their hand. I believe at this point, just fire up a factory, figuring that they probably have like Counterspell and Swords to Plowshares left in their hand, and we're pretty sure it's going to eat a plow. I go ahead and pump it just to get up a little bit on life. It takes an additional lightning bolt to kill me now if they're running them. They go ahead and disenchant the Disrupting Scepter. I do protect the Disrupting Scepter with Counterspell. They play a Counterspell of their own, so we kind of knew they had it, but we just forced them to use it. And now we're going to get to do a big recall because their hand is empty, which is actually really great. So we're just going to get back the Loa, the Disrupting Scepter, and the James Tome here is kind of the plan. That gives us 3 sources of card advantage, essentially. We'll get rid of the worthless cards to include Balance and the Strip Mine and one of the Swords to Plowshares. I want to keep 1 to template against their factory. I do go ahead and just cast out the Disrupting Scepter here, and assume that I'm going to take a hit from the factory next turn if they would like to do that. They don't do that, so I just basically get an untap step, go ahead and force them to discard their last card, which happens to be Counterspell, play out my land, resolve the James Tome. I think it's still relevant to continue to play lands here, because if they do draw into like a Time Twister, they're gonna use it. They only activate 1 factory here, which I kind of wanted to get them to do this. I go ahead and STP it. Find another Scepter, which I believe I'm happy to play here because I have correction. I have Time Twister in hand, but actually what I opted instead to do is just to go for a decently sized Brain Geyser to put me back up to 7 cards and get more lands out of my deck. Very happy with that. I actually don't draw a card off of Loa there. I don't think I need to. I do go ahead and disenchant this factory. This is pretty much their only route to victory, is to try to out-tempo me with factories at this point, and it's probably not going to work. I mean, I'm just too far ahead on cards. I'll go ahead and draw here. Draw again. Find Ancestral. Play on a land. I just go ahead and use my mana to play out the other Disrupting Scepter. Again, like I said, I'm trying to set up Time Twister, so I want to get as many permanents out of my deck as possible. So if I draw it or they draw it, you know, I can ensure that they have more lands in their graveyard and more lands in their deck than I do in my deck. I'm basically just spell heavy. Go ahead and Ancestral there. Play out the Mox, play out the Factory, and play out Copy Artifact, copying one of the tomes, I believe, after I've drawn for the turn. And now my plan's kind of coming together. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for them to get out of this. They have gone from, I believe, 3 factories to just 2. No, 2 factories to 0. And I have 3 factories that are active now. I'll get in for 4 damage this turn, and then basically I'm just looking for Fireball, and then I can end the game pretty fast because of the vast mana advantage I've currently got. Draw another factory. That's whatever. Again, I just want to get out of my hand. I really don't want that card in my hand. It's better to be on the board. And because it's an unboarded match, it's not likely they have Return to Dust to deal with that many artifacts. They probably have to disenchant them one by one. They go ahead and explore, i.e. Time Walk. Could have gone for a draw there. I don't. Mostly for time's sake. I'm a little behind on time. They go ahead and throw a Bolt at face. I go ahead and play out one of my Cities of Brass, activate all of the Mishra's Factories, get them down to 7. And what I'm looking to do is set up the Fireball that I've drawn on next turn. They draw a land, do us the nicety of playing it out, but I don't think it mattered here. I think we had enough mana to force them to discard plus play the Fireball. I just go ahead and Fireball them for 7 here and end the game. So this game, you know, is pretty clear. Early advantage, early card advantage with uncontested, without an answer on the opposing side. Kind of followed up by continued overwhelming card advantage, which just kind of snowballed into a victory. This game wasn't exceedingly interesting from a mirror match perspective, but the next one I think actually is significantly more interesting from gameplay, because I think it kind of highlights some intriguing things about the matchup, and of course, you know, there's obviously some variance and some luck that is involved in it too, because generally speaking, if you're playing from behind, it tends to come up that, you know, you have to get a little bit lucky to win. But the next one, we definitely get to play from behind. And so I'm going to go to a quick pause, and I'll jump into that match, guys, and we'll see you here momentarily. Alright, guys, back. So, first hand. First 2 hands, unkeepable. Had only colorless mana sources and not really high payoff cards. This 5, I'm going to keep on 5 pretty much every time. This 5's acceptable, though. Land on top, I keep. I need to make my land drops in the mirror. Opponent, unfortunately, has a similar start to what I had last time, but they have a turn 1 Jane Tome, so we're in a lot of trouble here. We have to hope they don't have a lot of other gas. It doesn't appear they do. They just go ahead and draw here. I draw into a Strip Mine, which is great. I just want to hit land drops. It's really all I want to do right now is just hit land and continue to develop my board, because the one cool thing about this matchup is it's very hard for them to actually kill me. They have to kill with Fireball or Mishra's Factories. So I'm going to continue to, I have these 2 Swords to Plowshares, and they're just great here because they can try to counter them if they like, but if they do, then they're short a counter, and then, you know, I can Strip Mine them. Basically, it's not hard. I don't think it's hard to fight from behind, but I think you have to be really smart about how you do it. So I actually don't blow up the factory here, because I would actually rather Strip Mine their colored sources, because colored resources are actually more important to the deck than their actual threats. And the actual threat lands I would like to Swords to Plowshare, so it means that if they ever do Time Twister, there's less likelihood of them actually drawing cards that actually kill me. So I'm obviously very behind here. I'm not very likely to win this game, but I'm trying to play it in a way that I could win. And I think I said at one point to him, it's probably smarter for me just to concede this one and go to game 3. And in an actual event, I may have, depending on if we would have drawn or not. They go ahead and disenchant my Mox. Yep, cool. I'm not gonna counter that. Again, I'll draw into more lands, I think. They Jane Tome here. With Time Walk, Jane Tome is kind of like a de facto Planeswalker. I'm happy to see Lightning Bolt in their deck still, so I don't think it's very great in the mirror. But actually, there was a weird thing that happened in this game. Neither of us sideboarded. We both sideboarded, but MTGO did not save our sideboarding results. This, however, is a problem. So the problem with Disrupting Scepter and why I think it's more relevant in the mirror match is because this card right here can actually keep me from finding a way to win or finding a way to get back in the game. I draw very well this turn. This is where some of the luck comes in. I draw into a Disenchant. and I'm able to get rid of it because that card is going to beat me. Tome is a problem. Tome generates options, but Disrupting Scepter removes options, which is funny to say, but in most Eternal formats, like you look at like a deck like Stacks. Like, Stacks is great because it basically says, like, hey, you can't play spells. The ability to find more options, I think, is oftentimes overshadowed by the ability to limit options. The older the format is, because the prison cards are just so powerful in this time frame. So my opponents resolved 2 Ancestrals at this point. 2 Time Walks. Like, we should be losing the game handily, but as you can tell, like, we've been able to stop like the cards that actually kill us. And nothing's happening. Like, I knew this was going to get disenchanted. I'm like, this is either going to get countered or disenchanted, but I kind of want them to do that. I want to just dredge as many cards out of them as I can. Like, just remove their card pool. They go for a Jambay Tome activation. I go ahead and, in response to the activation, go ahead and Ancestral. Disenchant the Jambay Tome to take them off of card advantage. And now they're at 3 cards. I'm at 3 cards. They just have a bazillion mana. So at this point, I've kind of turned the game a bit. I do get rid of the moat because I do want the option to try to go for a tempo or beatdown win with my Mistress Factories. The chances are their 3 cards are nonsense in hand, like probably like 2 Swords to Plowshares or a Disenchant Swords to Plowshares and a Counterspell. I do go ahead and play out the Fell War Stone. I don't plan on attacking yet. If I can develop my mana base, I will develop my mana base. If I cannot, I'll try to go for the tempo route. But with them on 24 life, they're at a pretty sizable life total. It's going to take some time. Not a bad draw there. I do go ahead and fire up one of these, and I fully plan on getting Swords to Plowshares. They make a micro mistake here and actually target it before it is attacking, which allows me to gain additional life. Why that's relevant is because the other way they win is through Fireball and or just Burn. Like, I guess their deck has a couple Lightning Bolts in it and a Fireball. And Fireball would be pretty sizable right now, and the gain of 4 is actually pretty relevant because it basically takes away 4 mana on the turn they're trying to win. So I was pretty happy with that result. I was pretty sure they had it. I'm still going to attack with the Factory to force them to use it, so I know. It also takes them off of Library of Alexandria a little bit longer. I'm going to do a counterspell check here on them. So I cast out the Brain Geyser, find a Mind Twist, which means that I can get them back down on cards on the following turn. They draw up to 7, draw an 8th card, find the Mind Twist here. This is a possible turning point in the game. If they have counter backup for this, I'm probably going to lose. They unfortunately do not, which means that I'm going to have a pretty strong reversal on the following turn to go into my own Mind Twist and put them down to 0 cards in hand. I feign that I have Red Elemental Blast, but at this point in time, we're both conversing during the game because we had two-way talk on. And, MTGO failed to save our sideboarding, and I don't obviously run a Reb main because you saw my deck already. I'm running my main deck still. They go ahead and dump the cards they can, but lose the rest of them, which it looks like it's just a bunch of land and the Abyss, which doesn't really do anything. We go ahead and resolve a recall here. They drew Counterspell exactly for the turn, which is kind of savage, but I have another Counterspell. And I am going to fight to preserve the recall, and I'm going to get back the Ancestral Recall and the Jambay Tome. With them at 0 cards in hand, I think, at this point, they're going to play whatever they play out if I don't get the Disrupting Scepter. Disrupting Scepter is important earlier, and at this point we're trying to control the game. So they drew another Counterspell, which is pretty strong, but I actually think they wanted to counter the Jambay Tome over the Ancestral Recall. Jambay Tome is a long-term card or source of card advantage. Obviously we don't really want to be drawing more Jambay Tomes, but sometimes that happens. Find a Scepter, which means that we can at least, at a minimum, take them off counter magic if the game goes really long here. Fireball is kind of like Tendrils in Legacy or Vintage Storm. You want to have it when you want to have it. You don't really want to have it when you're not trying to win with it. So I would have rather had any card other than that, but we're slowly mounting a comeback in this game that kind of looked like it was all but in the books. And we kind of mount a pretty savage Cinderella story here against our opponent. We do go ahead and trade factories here. This play makes sense by my opponent. They're trying to reduce my number of mana sources because of the mana intensity of my cards that tap for mana but don't do damage to me. Right now they want to get my life total as low as possible, and they're trying to do that with City of Brass. But unfortunately for them, I'm drawing a bazillion cards. I do want to leave up Swords to Plowshares for my own factory so that I can gain 2 life or 3 life out of nowhere, essentially. In case they draw the Fireball. it may or may not screw up their math. Their fireball looks like it's going to be quite large. I'm also trying to feign that I have counter magic here because if they draw, I really don't want them to just go for it. I kind of want them to try to protect it. But at this point, they are down to, I believe, 1 counter spell and 1 mana drain left in deck or in hand. I draw into another counter spell here, which is great. Very good pickup there. Go ahead and draw. Find more land. I'm very happy to be finding lands because one of the ways they get out of this is they're very ahead on board. They're very ahead on mana on board. Is they find a draw 7, and that would be bad for us. So now we're basically just hitting them again with the Rod in the Book. And you can see, despite a very behind position in the beginning, we kind of managed to come ahead, or get ahead here, or find a path to get ahead. Go ahead and draw here. Find the Emerald. What I'm actually looking to do is mill them out. So I have a Fireball, but they're at 24 life. They have a ton of life, and getting to 24 mana and trying to beat through their factory seems like it's kind of silly. Then go ahead and activate this. This is essentially going to put them at 26 because I go for a Swords to Plowshares on this Gentleman right here. This is how we know that. So all the counter spells are out of their deck. Here is the mana drain, so they should be out of counter magic in deck. We double Swords to Plowshares because Swords to Plowshares is really just in the deck to stop Mishra's Factory. And I believe we have 3 of them exiled at this point. Yeah, 3 of them are exiled. 1 of them was disenchanted in this game. So we'll go ahead and close this down. So at this point, they're pretty much going to play whatever they draw. They draw Brain Geyser here. I do a quick, so I actually let this resolve. I do a quick look through their deck, and I'm like, all right, the worst things they can draw are a draw 7, which I'll counter, or a Fireball, which I'll counter. Basically, they'd have to draw like Fireball plus Time Twister to really get me scared. And if they do a Fireball for lethal, then it's going to be then they could try to resolve a Time Twister afterwards. I'll counter that, and then they'll try to Time Twister afterwards, but they'll be at they'll have to use like more mana resource. They'll have to basically be tapped out, like unless they have the Lotus, but then they would be at 3 mana. So I allow everything they play to resolve. Don't counterspell it, because my game plan is this. Like, the reason I let it resolve is I deliberately went through their graveyard and said, all right, what's in your graveyard? And I realized, hey, there's no counter magic left in their deck, so if I want to counter anything, I'm going to be able to counter the first thing the first thing I want to counter will get countered. And then if they have a secondary extremely relevant spell, they get me with it. But what I want to go for here is I actually want to regrowth the Brain Geyser and actually mill them out. So that was kind of my strategy and why I allowed that to happen. If they had even had 1 counter spell left in the deck, I probably wouldn't have played it that way. But I knew that they didn't, so I was like, okay, well, if they don't have a counter spell, then I'm going to be able to resolve whatever I need to resolve, both on my turn and on theirs. So I think it was the right line to allow the Geyser to resolve. It's possible I did not want to, but I also didn't have enough mana to kill them on the next turn, and this line of play allows me to kill them right now by forcing them to draw the remaining 5 cards or the 4 cards in their library and draw a 5th card that doesn't exist to mill them out. So, Game 2 was infinitely more interesting. Obviously down to the wire. I'm at 56 seconds. Playing from behind can definitely be difficult with the deck. A couple of the things that I think you can take away from this matchup that I think are interesting is that there were a lot of times I could have countered cards like, their 2 Ancestral Recalls, their Time Walk. Oftentimes in the mirror matches between the deck and another version of the deck, I think it's better to focus on threats as opposed to draw, because the deck is really just a mana and draw engine. Like, that's all it does. It just plays lands, plays mana, and draws cards, and has very, very, very few ways to win the game. And because most of the time these decks only have like 5 actual literal counter spells, how you use permission becomes really relevant. For one, I don't really like the Moat still being in there. I don't like the Abyss being in there. I recognize I still have the Abyss in my deck, but neither of us, for some reason, Moto failed to sideboard both of us. So we're both still playing with our main decks. So here I didn't have a fear of Reb or anything like that, because I typically, I did sideboard, but it didn't save it. I typically bring in this matchup, 2 Dust to Dust and 3 Red Elemental Blasts at the price of the Abyss. Generally, some number of Swords to Plowshares, like 1 Swords to Plowshares, and generally 1 Disenchant and like 1 Fell Warstone is kind of how I generally tend to sideboard it. But the interesting thing is when you have these counter spells, you only have a certain number of them. I mean, yes, you can go Eternal with the deck and continue to use Regrowth to loop Time Twister in order to continue to draw your spells. But one of the interesting things is if you haven't had the opportunity to do that yet, an apt opponent who generally understands the construction of the deck can simply go through your graveyard and say, all right, like how can you win? What do I need to stop next? I.e., how are my counter spells relevant? And how can you stop me? And in this case, what I did is I said, okay, I think this Brain Geyser's fine because there are 4 counter spells in your graveyard, there's 1 mana drain in your graveyard, 2 lightning bolts. So ostensibly from 10, like, how do you kill me? You have to fireball me. At most, you have 2 more lightning bolts, but probably only 1 or none left in the deck because lightning bolts obviously it's a little bit worse than Swords to Plowshares, at least in this matchup. I tend to think. And that's kind of how we ended up playing this one, and I think it ended up paying off. I mean, as you can see, we definitely let some stuff that was a little more suspect to allow to resolve, and we also got very lucky. Hitting the 2 disenchants on the time frame we needed to when our opponent was essentially on air draws, on land draws, was exceedingly solid because we were able to just deal with their Jane Day Tome to get rid of their recurring source of card advantage and also get rid of their moat so we could utilize our Mishra's Factories if we opted to go that way. Although in retrospect, it probably may have been better to actually save the other disenchant for another Jane Day Tome, but I felt like at the time, there was a very strong possibility when I was only like 4 or 5 mana sources that I may have to go the tempo route and actually beat them down. Even though I knew it would be tough because they probably had like 1 to 2 Swords to Plowshares. But yeah, at the end of the day, very, very cool matchup, and actually a very cool way to finish the game off. Getting to Brain Geyser an opponent out in a deck mirror match to deck them with the deck is pretty sweet. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'm going to go on to a secondary game with a much different set of decks. Alright guys, back. So if you've watched my recent content, you've seen that I kind of took a recent spur or just a recent building spree with Atog Aggro. So Atog Aggro is all about the Hammer Anvil combo of Black Vice, Ankh of Mishra, and then generally tends to use Atog to eat up vast swaths of life in the mid-game, which for this deck is like turn 3. It's a very fast deck, very active. What do I think of this hand? This hand's interesting. So this hand can play out the Hammer Anvil, but is not playing an Atog anytime soon, so I keep it. It's a little greedy. The Mox was a great draw because I get to go ahead and strip mine my opponent here, which is great because it means they're likely to play less cards on the next turn, which means Vice is going to get in a little more damage. It also means they're going to be forced to play more lands out because I have an Ankh of Mishra. So I mean, basically, if they don't play lands out, they take damage off Vice. If they play lands out, they take damage off Ankh. It's kind of a catch-22 is kind of the way you have to look at it. I go ahead and resolve the Mana Vault because it just makes sense for mana efficiency. Play out the Mishra's Factory, taking 2 this turn, but planning on dealing 2 additional next turn. Play on a City of Brass, which I'm very happy to see. Play an invested card in the form of Sylvan Library, which is not great against this deck. Yes, I can find powerful cards, but you generally don't want to spend life on it. Find another Mishra's Factory, which is not the best draw in the world, but it's also not the worst. Go ahead and activate my factory, pump it up to a 3/3. Swing in there, putting my opponent down to 8. So they're in a pretty rough spot right now. Basically, they need to have like a Black Lotus or a bunch of fast mana that gets around my cards. They do have the Black Lotus, the Eureka. Eureka is actually not horrendous for me because I have 2 Atogs that I cannot play right now. And Atog can actually outgrow both of the threats that my opponents played, even though it's a much cheaper card. I do go ahead and sacrifice the Mana Vault to prevent, an additional life loss here. Draw another Atog, oddly enough. Utilize the Mana Vault to activate both of my factories and go ahead and swing. I'm going to win in combat here because my opponent is forced to, I can allow both my Atogs to die, but realistically they have to kill one of my factories. So they go ahead and kill one of the factories. I eat it before it dies with one of the Atogs. And I go ahead and eat enough cards to kill basically all of their threats. And I have 2 1/2s, but they're at 1 life. Play a land, die. And that is the end of the first game with Atog Aggro versus Eureka, which is a pretty sweet deck. Alright guys, quick pause and we'll be back for a second round of Atog Aggro. Alrighty guys, back. This hand is meh. Not a fan of it, but I do keep it. I think it's on the borderline of keepable, but I do not want to draw mountains at this point, and I am drawing mountains, which is not great. So I go ahead and get in 2 damage here. Not very good. Birds of Paradise tends to be pretty good against Black Vice. Opponent goes for a card. I figure it's probably Black Lotus into Eureka, which is kind of my fear. But as I find out after the game or during the game, it's probably not. I draw another mountain, which is just a horrendous draw. But we did keep his hand, so we have to, accept our just desserts here. and just assume that that's a thing that could happen. We do strip mine, so I want to put them back. Evidently, what they went for with Demonic Tutor was Ancestral Recall, which is an interesting choice because it actually plays into my cards pretty well, which I'm fine with. It allows me to get a little more damage with the Vice. Draw very well this turn and draw into an Ankh of Mishra here. Ankh is going to also tie up their mana, so unless they Eureka this turn, we're probably going to be we're okay. But this does take them down to 9. They go ahead and Time Walk here, which is fine by me because it means more damage off my stuff. My stuff is really just doing more work on their turn than it is mine. I'll go ahead and take 1 off of my Mana Vault and Copper Tablet here. Draw for the turn into another Mountain, I believe. My draw has not been great this game, but I did draw into the Ankh. The Ankh is kind of what is sealing the deal here. They take 1 and 2 down to 1, and now they're dead to my my Black Vice on the next turn and or my Copper Tablet. But it's irrelevant because my artifacts have done enough damage to them. So even without drawing a creature source of damage, the deck was able to just get there on its artifacts alone. I play another Ankh out just a joke and say go, and Copper Tablet does my opponent in. So I think looking at this game, like DT was interesting for Ancestral. I think I'm 90% sure that's what they went for. This deck plays a bunch of big dudes, and if it doesn't have an opening hand Eureka, it tends to be kind of a struggle for it. Now, if my opponent had played Eureka, I probably would have just died this game because they get like 3 to 4 creatures down on turn 3. With 6 power, 5 power, 4 power that turns into 7 essentially when it lightning bolts you, i.e. Triskelion. You can just die very fast. It also plays Concordant Crossroads, which gives everything haste. I think their deck can definitely benefit more from that card than mine can because I only have the Atogs. I actually took the mechanics out, but probably incorrectly because there are still Birds of Paradise in the matchup, and maybe the mechanic would have been good. But anyways, kind of an interesting matchup. So this is a deck I worked on historically. Did a deck tech on my YouTube page, and have found it's actually quite good. Then I looked at like the 2018 GP results. I think out of Cali, I forget where. But anyways, there's a big GP where this format was played, and there were like 2 to 3 Atog Aggro decks in the top 8. So the deck's obviously quite good. I don't know how many of them play Orcish Mechanic. I'm playing it in here, but I did sideboard it out in this game, mostly for fun. But the deck is obviously very strong, and we really don't even need an Atog to win the game because these artifacts that we have are pretty powerful together and definitely put a beating on control and can even, in some cases, get there against combo, which you got to see here. Alright guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it here for the old school content today. I hope you enjoyed the matches. That Game 2 of the deck mirror match was actually really great and showcased some interesting theory on the mirror match, threat density, Vice answer density, and how best to use the assets you have. I think it's really an enjoyable matchup to play because of the vast amount of interaction, the meaningfulness of the interaction that you have with your opponent, and then we have Atog Aggro, which just wins by turn 3, or turn 7 in this case, but get some diversity of decks. Alright guys, well I'm going to go ahead and cut it here. I'll probably be putting up some pre-modern content tonight as well. Hopefully you enjoy that, and we'll have that up momentarily. Alright guys, enjoy and take care now.